in Across the Fence, it's our monthly Bird Notes program, and we'll talk about some of the high flyers making their way through Vermont. Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. As always, on the fourth Wednesday of the month, I'm joined by Mark LaBarr, conservation biologist for Audubon, Vermont. Welcome back.
Thank you.
So there's a lot of movement in the bird world.
There is. It is fall, and we're in the midst of the fall migration. So we've got birds moving into Vermont, birds flying through Vermont, birds moving out of Vermont. And so everything from our small warblers, thrushes and songbirds and hummingbirds to some of the bigger birds, which we'll talk about today.
As a matter of fact, we're going to start off with some of the ones that are easier to see.
Right, and by easier, I mean, you know, a lot of birds, a lot of our small songbirds migrate at night. And so they are, you know, they're small, so you got to get out there and you got to start looking for them. They're up in the trees and it's a little bit more difficult. Some of those would be nocturnal migrants. We've got diurnal migrants as well, and those are the birds that migrate during the day. And they would include things like waterfowl and a lot of our raptors that take advantage of the daylight hours and the thermals, which lift them up in order to make their way south.
Which must make them popular to watch.
They are, because they can be big. They can be somewhat small too. You know, some of the sharp-shinned hawks and stuff like that can be small. But for the most part, you can get yourself up on a mountain and you can look out and you can see these birds when the weather conditions are right.
So what are some of the species that we're talking about?
Well, probably the granddaddy of them all is the broad-winged hawk as far as numbers. This is a forest hawk that we have here in Vermont, but when it moves through Vermont, especially along the Champlain Valley and in the Connecticut River Valley, they can move through in very large numbers. It's a hawk that is seen, you can see here it has these really broad white stripes on its tail, and that's a good indicator. Big fat wings, short tail. So this is a bird that takes advantage of those thermals, those warm air things that are lifting up off the ground. You get a little north wind and then you get these massive flights or kettles of broadwings as they move through the valley. From places like Mount Philo, Poultney Mountain, other locations, Buck Mountain, you know, these are viewpoints where you can see these big kettles moving down the length of the Champlain Valley.
Is there any daytime that's better to see them, or?
Oftentimes, you know, sometime between 11 and 2, if the weather's right, because it does take a little bit of time for that, the ground to warm up and that warm air to start lifting and causing those thermals. So usually the middle part of the day is the best. In fact, some of the highest migration counts, more than 1,100 birds, have been seen between noon and 2 o'clock in the afternoon from Mount Philo.
Wow, that's a lot of birds. What other species might we be able to see and identify easily?
Well, the big ones, another one is a red-tailed hawk. And again, this is one of those big raptors, big fat wings, and that distinctive red tail, which you can see if the bird is moving along and it's moving close to you. You can pick that tail out, pretty easy to see. An osprey are also on the way, or fish hawk. This bird has real distinctive black patches there you can see just under the wings, and oftentimes those wings, you can kind of see it here, they're kind of crooked back a little bit right where those black patches are. So a little bit narrower wing, that distinctive under wing pattern tells us that we've got an osprey moving down the down the flyway.
Okay,
and
excellent.
then, of course, probably the biggest one we'd see would be, and we're seeing more and more of them, is the bald eagle. And, this is an adult bald eagle with that nice white tail and white head. You can see juvenile bald eagles that'll come through, subadults that, may be all brown or may have some brown in their heads and stuff like that, but their sheer size kind of gives them away as as to it being a bald eagle.
And there are also some bigger birds that aren't so easy to see.
Yeah, and what happens is those bigger birds are the ones that are pretty easy to pick up. You've got, hawk watching is a big event. There's been some big events by the local Audubon chapters down at Buck Mountain. They saw more than 800 raptors on Poultney Mountain not too long ago. Mount Philo is a great place. You get good weather, you're going to find people up there. So those big ones are kind of the easy ones, but you may need to bring or have somebody with a spotting scope in order to find some of the other ones. And you just get down to the smaller accipiters or woodland hawks. Things like the Cooper's hawk. okay, which drops in size. We're looking at a bird that is, more crow-sized than it is, say, a red tail. And this Cooper's hawk, you can see that really long tail, which kind of points out that it's a accipiter. And Coopers have a rounded tail at the end there. And that's one of the ways that I tell Coopers from sharp-shinned hawks. Round is shaped like a C. And so that's how I kind of put those two together. Here's a sharp-shinned hawk. You can see very similar.
Yep, I think that's one that's been around our house.
Right,
yep.
And so this is a little bit bigger than a jay, but a lot of things, but that really sharp, straight cutoff at the tail. So those are two species that you will also see migrating along. Again, a little bit smaller, so oftentimes, off in the distance, they just become hawk SP, hawk species, the unidentified hawks. That
like
people
LBBs.
See. Exactly, little brown birds. So little specks out there on the horizon.
And so, but some of these will hang around for the winter.
Yes. So, things like Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks are often feeder birds. These are birds that will visit feeders and haunt feeders. They prey on, oftentimes small birds and such like that.
I feel guilty.
What's that?
I feel guilty for feeding the birds.
Birds at feeders eat different things. Let's just put it that way.
Okay.
Red tails are often picked up on our Christmas bird counts, so they're often around. And then even bald eagles. We have our winter bald eagle count that we do every year, and oftentimes we have more bald eagles in the state of Vermont in the wintertime than we do in the summer months. So although many of these raptors move south, there are those that linger around. And in milder winters, we can probably expect to see more than in some of the harsher winters.
You talk about the shape is important, because that's how I figured out that I had a sharp shin, not a Cooper's hawk.
Right. And again, you've got that, thinking about that red tail and the broad wings, big fat wings, short stubby tail, versus the accipiters, long skinny tail. They got some broad wings too. And then you start getting into the falcons, the falcon shapes. And the falcons, like the American kestrel, have well, this is actually a harrier. So this is another one that a bigger bird that you can see that uses the shape. This is what's called a dihedral, and oftentimes you'll see harriers float with their wings in that V-shaped pattern. So that's one way of doing it. That bright white rump is another one that kind of shows you that you've got a harrier in front of you. Now to the falcons. The falcons have, again, long tails, kind of like the accipiters, but really pointy wings. You can see how the wings kind of come out. This is an American kestrel, and they have a very strong angular shape to them. Peregrine falcons are similar. They're just sometimes a little bit bigger. They've got that facial pattern, but again, you can see how the wings, instead of spreading out, and oftentimes you'll see the kind of the fingers that stick out. With the falcons, you have that very pointed wing. And then, of course, one of the big ones, which we've seen more and more here in Vermont over the past 2-3 decades, the turkey vulture. This, like the harrier, has that dihedral or V-shaped wing pattern. And oftentimes you can tell this bird, it's big, it's got those big fingers, but it also has, it doesn't look like it has a head.
Yeah, it's kind of creepy looking.
Yeah, and that's they've evolutionarily lost their feathers on their head, and that allows them to, put their heads into body cavities and things like that, and not have to worry about cleaning those feathers after they've had something good and dead to eat. Sweet.
Some raptors can be confusing in other ways. You have an interesting picture from Lori Capsey?
I do. This is, Lori wrote me and she said, "Hello, Mark. I took these photos while four-wheeling in Montgomery, Vermont today. I've never seen anything like it. It's large, like an eagle or hawk, looks pure white, except for a peach color in the tail feathers. Was a beautiful sight. He was a long distance away and unfortunately not facing me. Not sure if he's native to Vermont."
Boy, good job getting that picture.
Yes, she did, especially from a four-wheel. I'm assuming she stopped it. But it's interesting, if you look at that little bit of peach on the tail, this is probably a leucistic red-tailed hawk.
Wow.
And, leucistic birds, it's a recessive gene in the birds. We've talked about this before. and it causes the pigmentation to be non-existent a lot, although it can show itself in that red tail, or sometimes you can have a red head or a goldfinch that's, half white, chickadees half white. It's a little bit different than albinoism, but in birds it presents itself in a bunch of different ways, which oftentimes can be really cool.
Yeah.
That one might have been a little bit difficult at a distance to tell what it was, but again, that peach color or the remnant of the red tail kind of clues us in to that bird.
Interesting.
And we, in that same vein, we have a picture in here from Kathleen and Bill Russell of Northfield, Vermont. I got this picture and I emailed her to ask if I could use it on the show. And this is a leucistic hummingbird.
Wow.
So this is a picture. She writes, "You certainly can use the albino hummingbird pics for your upcoming show." She would like to watch it, so I let her know that we're on the fourth Wednesday of every month. Thanks so much for emailing me. This really was a sight when it appeared at our hummingbird feeder on Saturday, and so glad we were home to see it and take pictures. Then got to enjoy a long Labor Day weekend, and then on Wednesday, I guess her husband watched it drinking constantly at the feeder, and then it flew away. So probably a bird migrating through. Hummingbirds, there's been a lot of reports of hummingbirds. The last date for hummingbirds is sometime in early October, the 10th of October, as these birds begin to migrate as well. People often ask with hummingbirds whether or not they should leave their feeders up, whether that's going to keep the hummingbirds from migrating through, and that's not the case. It's good to leave the feeders up. They need the food as they're moving south. And they'll move along at their own pace. We have one, I think, final picture here. This is from my friend Maggie Moore down in Boston. She happened to be in New Hampshire and had a brand new camera. And so she took this picture of this great blue heron standing up on top of a skylight, I guess. And my first thought, of course, with the positioning of this heron was, let's hope somebody doesn't have to get up there and clean that skylight. That just seems like
a disaster waiting to happen.
It does. But, again, great blue herons, they're moving as well. They do stick around sometimes in the winter. We pick them up. But just a lot of things that are making their way to some to Central America, South America, things like bobolinks, all the way down to the southern cone, down to Uruguay and Paraguay. Other things like our grasshopper sparrows, which we have just a few of here in the state, which make just a short hop and end up down in the southern U.S. as their migration. So different distances, different birds, but lots of things to see out there. So
now, we're coming to the end of summer, obviously, in falls here. When should people start thinking about putting their feeders up?
Feeders are always one of those things, and it depends on where you are. Obviously, if you're in an area where bear are a problem, you're going to want to start, push that off to a later date, November, that kind of thing. I know Bob Spear feeds birds year-round up at our place and doesn't have too much of a problem. So folks can start thinking about getting their feeders up in the next month, as long as they're not, in a situation where they might have birds that, bears that show up and take advantage of that before they head off into hibernation. And so what else can people expect in the fall with their birds? Well, one of the things that happens is flocking. So, and this is where you'll begin to see, and folks that go out and bird will often see flocks of birds move through. Their birds aren't defending territories anymore, so everybody kind of co-mingles. And so oftentimes, especially with groups of warblers, when folks go out, they'll see whole flocks move through. And that, being in a group is a safety issue. You've got more eyes to keep out for a predator, and your chances of getting eaten by a predator, say a sharp-shinned hawk or a Cooper's hawk, is much less. And so, it's one of those things that you'll see birds in clusters. Certainly feeders begin to pop up. One thing that I do want to mention is, as fascinating as migration is, there are, a lot of natural hazards that happen, but there's a lot of man-made hazards too. And this is the time of year when many birds run into windows, especially as they're moving through big, large cities. They're attracted to the lights. And Audubon actually has a campaign in a number of cities to try to have the lights turned off in cities or minimized as much as possible during this time of year. It saves everybody money, and it allows the birds to be not so confused as they head south and hopefully not run into one of those big glass buildings.
Well, thanks a lot, Mark. We'd like to point out if you have a bird-related question, you can pass it along to Mark. You can contact him at Audubon, Vermont at the address on your screen, or you can contact him by email. His address is mlabarr@audubon.org. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.
For a video copy of today's program, call toll-free 1-888-ATF-3430. Across the Fence is brought to you as a public service by University of Vermont Extension and WCAX-TV.